Hello, I'm Demetrius Glevich, and I'm going to be talking about our first reading of Nietzsche. This section started with Nietzsche's maxims, they moved on to his criticism of Socrates and philosophers in general, and ended with a formal set of statements along with a history of error. So, in my excellent library adventure, I found two books of note: The Meaning of Life, Perspectives from the World's Great Intellectual Traditions by Professor J. L. Garfield, and then also Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist by Walter Kaufmann. So in the first text I mentioned, The Meaning of Life, what struck me most is something Garfield said, that Nietzsche's writing can sometimes blind us to the depths of his critiques. So it seems like with Nietzsche in particular, it's important to first understand what he is saying. It's very easy to just read and just get lost in what he's talking about. It has a lot of small ideas within the greater picture of things, and stepping back is also an important part, especially with Nietzsche. So, what I found to focus on is focusing on like the singular words that Nietzsche uses as like broad ideas, um, which is how words work really. Like, say, you have a conception of justice and etc. etc. And with Nietzsche, he's really particular with how he does this. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, what do you think Nietzsche means when he uses words like decadence or tyrant or parent world? I don't think a common understanding of these words does justice to what Nietzsche is saying when he uses them. Um, so moving on to like the actual content of what he's saying, in the first little text I read, um, the title of this essay is "How to Philosophize with a Hammer." The subtitle is "Twilight of the Idols." So the text commented on this, and what Garfield said was that Nietzsche was using his hammer to smash the idols of modernity, right? Things that we hold and say are valuable. And what he's doing is he's trying to show how empty apparently these are, and so that they're idols, not that they're actual values. So rather than being a value, something that carries weight, it's an idol. It's made up. It's empty. There's nothing to it. A person from outside would look at it and be very confused why we hold them so highly. And so at this point in the text, can you guys see what idols Nietzsche is talking about? I really don't think it's become too apparent where he's going with it. This is like the whole point where the bigger idea is you can't really see it until you really read through most of what he's been written here. So if you do, I'm wondering what do you think they are, provided you haven't read ahead. So in the second text I mentioned, it was Walter Kaufmann's commentary of Nietzsche. So Kaufmann talks in detail about how Nietzsche viewed Socrates. And contrary to what was easily seen in the text we read, Nietzsche didn't repudiate Socrates across the board, at least not across the board. So like many of his ideas, Nietzsche's views of Socrates was multifaceted. Even in Twilight of the Idols, where Socrates is apparently the buffoon who got him taken seriously. What happened there, right? In the very next page, you can find evidence of why Nietzsche did like Socrates, at least in some capacity. He wrote that the world needed him, Socrates. And to understand how that comes about, where we call him buffoon, but apparently he was needed, you realize that really Nietzsche's making a bit of a cosmic argument. So according to Kaufmann, what Nietzsche is saying is that the absurdly rational Socrates forced a course adjustment. He was showing the limits of science, that doing what Socrates was doing was apparently actually the wrong thing to do. And what comes from this hyper rationality is a rebirth of art, like of subjectivity, right? Where you revel in indefinite stuff. Um, and what Walter Kaufmann also points out here is, in a different text, Nietzsche even points out that perhaps art is even a necessary corollary and supplement to science. And this is why Nietzsche has a favorable view of Socrates. In his view, what Socrates did was he forced it into that balance between a subjective and a scientific world. And so it's very easy to see why, while on one end Nietzsche didn't like Socrates, but on the other hand he did. But there's an issue with this. So it's a bit of an impossible situation. How do you reconcile the supposed necessity of Socrates, and therefore some capacity of good, with his apparent decadence? So the whole a big point of what Nietzsche is saying is that the philosophers, the great ones, are just signs of they're just examples of decadence. So how is it that something that is decadence that leads downward actually leads upward? It's a bit of a paradox. And on that note, what do you think of Nietzsche's viewpoint? Nietzsche accuses Socrates of valuing rationality at any price. Is it possible that this is a bad thing? This reminds me of a phrase, right? It went something like, "You can reason yourself into any conclusion." So that sort of takes that idea to light and says, "Oh, there is a limit to rationality. We can go too far here." But at the same time, the opposite end is just subjectivity. Surely you can't be completely subjective about stuff. If you say this is science and someone says that's not science, but what you're talking about is science, that you can't just say, well, that's just subjective and that's fine. That's a difficult thing to come up with. So it seems like what Nietzsche, I think, is what he's saying is a bit of a balance, right? A balance between the subjective and the definite of science. Well, is science definite even then? But so the question here is then, but in what context? It's hard to see a context where, like, specifically you would need there's a balance, and that's the best way forward, right? I think here it's on a macroscopic scale that you need a balance of subjectiveness and non-subjectiveness on a societal level, right? That if society goes too far in one direction or the other, that's the issue. So this leads to my final point I want to make, that I noticed, that I thought of while reading Kaufmann's commentary. So I noted while reading Nietzsche that he spoke with a high degree of absoluteness. This is like a sort of confidence in one sense. Like, it seems like Nietzsche really has a concrete view of what he thinks, but it's also a portrayal of black and whiteness. In fact, this is precisely the sort of behavior that Nietzsche was criticizing. So throughout the text, he expresses his version of certain ideas, and what he does is he knocks them down. And the idea with the black and whiteness is that he shows them how simple and empty they are. They're just like this easily explained paragraph, right? And he just knocks it down in just a couple sentences, or that's what he sees, right? But he actually spends very little time in this section really advocating for something in particular. He's just too busy with his hammer. So this really goes to, like, the greater picture of what Nietzsche is leading to, is that we're confusing the cause and effect when we see philosophers as an effect responding to decadence, the cause. and this is really where Nietzsche focuses his guns on Socrates. Socrates is not an example of good, but of decadence, apparently. Um, that these sages, not just Socrates, but this is where he focuses, are examples of decadence, and that's a hard pill to swallow. So that's where Nietzsche spends a lot of time, because he knows that's a hard one to say. Like, really, Socrates? You're gonna go after him? So he spends a lot of time showing us how these good idols, so we say, are perhaps not what they seem. That there's very little behind them, as he would say. Well, I don't know what he would say, but that seems to be where he's going with it, right? And I'm not sure if I agree with this supposition, but Nietzsche has a way with ideas, the way Socrates has a way with words. I think is a very good way to put it, which is why you see Nietzsche so opposed to Socrates. That's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say.